Joining us today, regular guest here on act.tv, economist Richard Wolff, host of Economic Update, among other things. Richard, thanks for joining us today.
Thank you very much, Juliana.
When we talked a little bit about what should be discussed, you wanted to discuss the Cold War aggressiveness that you're seeing in the Biden administration against Russia and China. Can you talk about what is going on and what is at stake? Why are they doing this?
Yeah, I'd like to talk about it because I think the American people are not getting the kind of understanding of something that could affect us as profoundly as anything we've been going through. And I include the pandemic and so on. We have a long history here in the United States of distracting our people from difficult, awkward, and in many ways bad developments in our own country by focusing on real or imagined enemies outside the United States. It's a very convenient distraction of people. You could see it in the Trump administration from the beginning, even before he won the presidential race in 2016, denouncing Mexicans in the most horrific manner imaginable, making an entire program out of hounding poor refugee immigrants trying to come to the United States after a century and a half of welcoming immigrants, then denouncing China, then slapping tariffs on literally everybody around the world, Canadians, Mexicans, Europeans, Indians. I mean, it never stopped. An endless posturing in which Mr. Trump was trying to suggest he's protecting us from the rest of the world. And I don't mean to single out Mr. Trump. That was an old pattern. He picked it up and ran with that ball. But the tragedy is that Mr. Biden is now doing it too. And he's picking on the same tried and true targets. He's not going after the immigrants yet, although that's beginning to change. So he's decided to focus yet once again on Russia and China. And let me explain a little bit briefly why that's so remarkable. Russia stopped being a communist country in 1989. That is, the Communist Party was removed from the government, was expelled from the political power it once had, and the quote-unquote socialist nature of the Russian economy, the Soviet economy, was unraveled, was changed, was dropped, so that private capitalist interests are the dominant economic reality in Russia. And that's been true now for over 30 years. What this attack on Russia, which culminated a week or so ago when literally the president of the United States referred to Mr. Putin in Russia as quote unquote a killer. This is extraordinary. And it's not a question of what is right and what is wrong and what is true and what isn't. That's a separate matter. Diplomacy doesn't work that way. It is a statement of aggressive hostility to do that. We couldn't even manage it with leaders around the world who we know very well are doing unspeakable things with which we allow them to function without interference. So what's going on? We were supposed to, in the 20th century, we were supposed to be in a great war with communism and socialism. And that was why we were told we were having to fight against the Soviet Union. Well, the Soviet Union doesn't exist. Socialism doesn't exist there anymore. The Communist Party is a small, unimportant sideshow in that society. And yet here we are again tilting against Russia. So it turns out it wasn't communism and socialism at all. What was it? It was a distraction. And you see it again here with China. The Chinese economy is much more successful than the Russian one was. The Chinese economy is going to be larger than the United States before the end of this decade. Everyone knows that, who pays any attention. There are a number of industries in which the Chinese have now exceeded the technological sophistication of the United States. That's part of why we went after the Huawei Corporation, et cetera, et cetera. All you're seeing here is a kind of, and I'm embarrassed to say it, whining on the part of the United States that the leadership in the global capitalist race has moved away from this country to the People's Republic of China. I'm not endorsing it, I'm not celebrating it, but to pretend that it isn't happening is childish. And when our leaders denounce the Communist Party that runs China, the Communist Party has been running China since 1949. It's the Communist Party of China that Kissinger and Nixon went to visit in order to reopen relations with them. It's the Communist Party of China that ran China for the last 30 years, during which virtually every major American corporation went to China, invested in China, produced in China. That's why if you go to your neighborhood Walmart, most of what you find on the shelf there was made in China. And that's what Walmart wanted, because that's what enabled Walmart to become the #1 employer in this country, because they were the ones who sold Chinese-made goods that were better in quality and cheaper in price, and why Americans responded. With all of that, this attack is a bizarre political hustle. It's designed to make a political leader get some more points, get some more votes, but what it is doing is risking world peace. And let's face one last point. Over the last 25 years, the United States, the mass of the American people, was able to sustain its standard of living in large part because a whole raft of products became cheaper. Computer goods, clothing, appliances, and they were made in China. And the standard of living of this country would be lower if we didn't have access to those goods. And that's why American companies went there. Half of what comes from China is produced by subsidiaries of American corporations. And this notion that the Chinese have ripped us off or they have cheated, this is the whining of somebody being outcompeted. It's very old in the history.
Didn't we give it to them? I mean, we gave them our corporations through trade, right? We said, go ahead, you can take your company and the manufacturing to cheaper labor. We did it ourselves, did we not?
No, absolutely. The corporations understood. And I've worked with a number of these corporations. I really do know this. These corporations understood, starting around the 1980s and 90s, they understood that if you went to China, if you closed your business in New Jersey or in Ohio or wherever you were, and you went to China, you got two fantastic advantages. Number one, the wages were way lower than what you had to pay in the United States. And number two, because wages in China were coming up and China has 4 times the population of the United States, you were going to be in a position in the fastest growing market in the world. Every graduate of an MBA program knows that if the wages are lower than everywhere else and the market in that country is growing better, you should be in on it because you will be outcompeted by others who are taking advantage. When you put all that together, American corporations went over there like gangbusters. The Chinese said to them, look, you can come in here and employ our people at a low wage. And you can come in here and take advantage of the market. But we in exchange want something from you. We want to share your technology. We want to learn your ways of doing business. You have things to teach us. That's the deal. No one had a gun to their head. No one required them to do it. The corporations went there, and then they made sure the American government, both Republicans and Democrats, gave them the freedom, as you rightly point out, to do all that. And they did all that. Now, at the end of 30 years of it, to say, gee, it didn't work out quite the way we wanted, that's not the basis of a mature country's international position. That's a politician looking to get some votes by posturing. We thought Mr. Biden had learned from Mr. Trump not to go down that route. Instead, he's looking more and more like Trump. The only difference is he adds Russia to China rather than tilting to China and not saying much about Russia.
When President Biden was vice president under Obama, one of the main things we often talked about was the Trans-Pacific Partnership, the TPP, and Obama was all for that. Has there been a major pivot in the Biden administration? People thought we were going to revive the TPP, which I disagree with, of course, under Biden.
No, I think what has happened is something like this. Part of the reason that Mr. Trump decided to target China has nothing to do with economics. It has to do with a political posturing. He knew that, for example, his effort to be friendly to Russia would get him in trouble with the Democrats, who enjoy blaming their loss in 2016 on the Russians. So he knew he would get into trouble. The one area where the Democrats couldn't say boo if he went after a foreign entity was China. So instead of targeting Mexico and Canada, which he tried at the beginning of his administration, or the Europeans, which he did periodically, the one place where he would get applause across the board, and we know how important that is to Mr. Trump, would be attacking China. And the same logic applies to Mr. Biden in reverse. He may be encountering difficulty from Republicans on a lot of issues, but beating up on the Chinese, carrying on with great statements like that, that's going to get the Republicans to be quiet, to support him, not to speak up against him. And that's very important for him to keep the kind of balance he thinks he needs to stay politically relevant in the United States.
You know, I didn't make this connection, and perhaps someone else has already done it in the media, but we had that mass killing of Asian American women in Georgia not too long ago.
That's right.
A lot of rhetoric, anti-Asian rhetoric from Trump and now from Biden. Do you think that possibly plays a role?
Absolutely. All kinds of people who don't pay attention to the details or the nuances of what's going on hear about the bad Chinese. That's all. And it gives people, particularly relatively unbalanced people, the notion that there's a socially approved target. There's a place to unload your anxieties, your bitterness, your angers, which may come from the life you're leading, the job you have or don't have anymore, the girlfriend or boyfriend that you don't have anymore, all the things that upset us in life. We're looking for a way to calm ourselves down. And then the government and the society says, well, over there are bad people and you do something bad to them, kind of it's okay. And, you know, you shouldn't do that. But if you have people who are not so clear on how the world works, yeah, they can focus their rage there. It's a very dangerous game to play. The minorities in America, Black and brown people in particular, they've been in that position for hundreds of years in this society, the allowable dump population upon which others can work off their unrelated psychological and other difficulties. I mean, an honest person knows that that's a problem, and you have to be very careful not to divide your society into horrific scapegoating that can destroy you. I mean, the Germans did it with gypsies and Jews and quote unquote non-Aryan people. We have within memory horrible examples. We know what the United States did to our Japanese American people in the West Coast during World War II, and the apologies ever since, and the regrets ever since. It's as if we haven't learned.
And the Italians too. No one
Absolutely.
Ever
I remember in New Haven, Connecticut, where I lived most of my life, which is a community with a disproportionately large Italian American population. I remember learning years after I was living there about the lynchings that took place at the end of the 19th century. The people who were lynched were Italian American immigrants by the English and Irish people who had come earlier and who were frightened by the new immigrants and invented all kinds of crazy stuff to blame on them and took lives of people because of this hysteria. I mean, it's as if we've forgotten all of our history and are now preparing to have it done again. And then we saw that horrific example in Atlanta. Yeah, terrible.
Professor Wolff, given what's happened over the last 30 years, which you referenced earlier in this interview, but also talk about weekly on your program, Economic Update. If anyone has not seen it, go on YouTube, subscribe immediately. The YouTube channel is Democracy at Work. Given where we are and what has happened and how the jobs have already been outsourced and the relationships, their current standing, if we had a worker-friendly, person-friendly response, a socialist-friendly response to the current situation when it comes to China and I guess Russia by proxy. It's not like our corporations went there, but they're connected globally. What would be the sane response? What would be the called for response at this point in history if we had political will by our whoever the current president was?
I think it would begin with a recognition that history teaches us that when the baton is passed, when the capitalist system of maximizing profits means that a part of where capitalism was is being left behind, capitalism is moving on. We know that from our own history. Capitalism got going in New England in this country, but eventually it went to the Midwest. And then eventually it went to the South and the Southwest of this country and California. The center of capitalist dynamism moves. And eventually you have to face the fact that it moved out of the United States, not elsewhere within it, but out of it. That's why General Motors produces many more cars in China and Mexico than it does in the United States. And I could give you 100 other examples. The center has moved. You have to recognize that. You can't try to stop it. That's not the way history works. And the effort to do that usually leads to war, not trade war, military war. And that's an unthinkable option at this point, although people are thinking about it, which is already a bad sign. The socialist alternative would be to face the reality. We don't want war. We don't want a confrontation between the United States, Russia, and China because both Russia and China have nuclear weapons. This is not like fighting against Iraq or Afghanistan. Wars, by the way, that the United States has been unable to win, but it's a much more formidable enemy. And the two of them together, and we are driving them together more than any other force right now in the world, Russia and China. They just had a meeting where they literally planned their coordination against the United States. We, as a socialist program, would say, no, stop. Let's work out a plan that meets your interests economically, you in the United States, and ours in China. We were getting along really quite well from around 1990 to Mr. Trump, 2015. So after that, things began to get ugly. So let's learn.
I mean, we were getting along well, but at the same time, all the corporations, our economy was being gutted.
That's right. And they were making money and they were happy. And now that the mass of Americans are saying, wait a minute, you made a lot of money, you corporations, and you who own the shares, you've made a lot of money. But the mass of the American working class was left out in the cold by this game. We've lost all the good jobs and good incomes. You've made the profits that come from being able to pay low wages. So yeah, it was good for you, that globalization, but it was awful for the mass of Americans. So the mass of Americans stood up. That's the problem. They stood up finally and they said no in lots of ways. And the ruling class of this country got frightened by where that might lead. And so a nice scapegoat is to blame the Chinese as if they did all the bad things.
Right.
It's an amazing scapegoating operation, but nobody really should be fooled. And if you allow this to go its last step, then the irony will be in a war, and you know who doesn't fight in a war? The people who made all the money getting us to it.
They make more money off of war.
Right. And the mass of people will be the ones who die and get hurt in that war. This is a disaster unfolded, which is why I wanted to talk with you about it.
I'm so glad you did.
We need a reset. We need to stop this program. Let me give you a historical example. The United States had a revolution to get away from Great Britain. Great Britain didn't want that. They wanted to make the money that you get off of a colony. That's why we had to have a revolution. And a few years after the revolution, we had something called the War of 1812, where basically the British tried to get it back even after the revolution. Then the British understood this is very dangerous. They were defeated in the revolution. They were defeated again in 1812. So they decided to change the tactic. And for the rest of the 19th century, they worked out a sharing with the United States. Look, in the long run, the United States has outrun Britain. Britain is now a colony of this country more than the other way around. That may happen with the Chinese too, but we didn't have a war with Great Britain ever again. And that might tell us something about the possibilities. The United States grew in the 19th century, so did the British. And that was a worked out arrangement after the failed efforts of military. I think we should learn from that. Otherwise, we will be condemned to repeat a history that I don't even want to think about, let alone scare people with.
I am really appreciating your take on this and that you're here talking with us about this. My questions, a couple of questions remain that I'd love to hear from you about. So in order to have a livable working class with a high standard of living in the United States, given what's happening with Russia and China, and to avoid war, how do we do that? Trade policy? Do we tell our corporations they have to bring their people back? Do we tariff and put levies on goods that are made overseas? How do we do this?
Well, there's a number of ways. First of all, what you want to do is you would like to begin by saying that a core objective, a basic objective of a decent society is to provide the mass of adults opportunities to work and earn a decent living. Notice what I'm saying. I didn't say that the first chief goal is profit. I said that the first chief goal is something else. And I say that as an economist. The reason we teach, and I believe this is a mistake, but the reason we teach that profit is the bottom line, and why we have business schools that teach people how to run a business so it maximizes profit, is because profit is what is taken by the people who own the businesses of this country. They're the ones who get the profit. The working class doesn't get the profit. The working class gets a wage and a job. The profit that working class produces goes to somebody else, namely the employers. So to say that we should maximize profit because that's how the market works, that's not a none too subtle way of saying we want business to be run for that minority of folks that run it, the employers. I get why they want it. What's a mystery to me, and has been all my life, is why the mass of the working class would agree to have an economic system that basically says we're running it for a minority of people, a small minority that are the employers, and not for the masses. For me, I wouldn't run the society that way. I would run it to say one of the most important, at least as important as anything else, is a good job, a secure job, and a secure, decent income to live a proper life. We can do that in this country, but we would have to reorganize enterprises and the economy to do it. And then in terms of other countries, let's do in the world what we have done in the United States. China will be given their areas. These are the things you do. And you do them well, and you're good at it, and you produce, and we will buy from you. And in exchange, here's the things that we do well in the United States. We have those things, and we will do it, and we will sell them to you. And we'll work this out, and we'll bring in Asia, Africa, Latin America, Europe. We will work it out. We've managed it with the huge complexes that we call the United States. 50 different states doing this. We have done that. I believe we can do that on a world level. And I tell you that the alternative is so horrible that we better get busy doing this kind of thing. But I don't think the capitalist system built on this profit-driven mania, if you like, they're not in a good position to do that. They don't think like that. They think in the short run to maximize the profits. That's what they do. They don't think about the long term, not because they're stupid. They're not. They're smart people. But they're driven by the success they can have this year or next year. They are not driven by the long-term consequences. They're not responsible for them. They won't be in the leadership of that corporation 10 years from now when those consequences play themselves out. We will, but they will have moved on to some other job. This is a very dangerous way to manage these kinds of problems.
Professor Wolff, thank you so much for bringing this to our attention. We are talking with Medea Benjamin on the program next week about the implications for war under the Biden administration. And so we are very grateful to talk about, again, the implications of war here with you, but from an economic perspective. Thank you so much.
My pleasure. Thank you, Juliana.